And so I'm going to walk you all through what's happened in the State House this week. My name is Erica Eiderhoven. I'm running for state representative for the 27th Middlesex District that represents the heart of Somerville. And so I want to share with you all what's been happening in the Massachusetts State House this week so that everyone can stay informed as to what's going on, particularly during this COVID-19 crisis. It's important that we all stay informed as to what our governments and particularly our state government is doing amidst this crisis. And so I'm going to just go over sort of the big votes that were taken this week. Just a little overview recap to make sure everyone's on the same page. I'm going to be talking about specifically the Massachusetts state government, and particularly the state legislature. Our state has a House and a Senate, and I will only be focusing on the House of Representatives, which is 160 members who represent us. And I'm running to be a state representative, so one of the 160 representing Somerville. And we're just going to go through the votes that they went through. I should note that some of these bills have not been voted on by the Senate yet, which is where the other chamber where votes need to be taken before a bill is sent to our governor, Governor Baker, to become into law. So let's just get started. So let's see, we can take a look here. I can make myself a little smaller. There we go. All right, so State House update. So I just want to recap before getting started that during the past 2 weeks, more Massachusetts residents have filed for unemployment than all of 2019 combined. So we have shattered the record in terms of number of people in our state who are filing for unemployment and are frankly financially in really precarious situations right now. And so the next question we should be asking ourselves is, what is our government doing to address this crisis? This crisis is both a public health crisis as well as an economic one. We are, set to experience probably one of the biggest recessions, if not depressions, that we've seen in our lifetimes. And so it's really important that we see what our government is doing to address this. So to just dive right in, we've had 3 votes in the House on COVID-19 this past week. One of the votes was on housing, so it was a pause on evictions and foreclosures. The second vote was around education, which includes the MCAS, graduation requirements, as well as a number of deadlines were decided. And I'll go through each of these deep dives in a minute. And then finally, we also had a vote on a municipalities bill. This included rules around utility payments or utility shutoffs, budgets, and taxes. And I just want to point out too, before we dive in, that these are all votes that we're taking in the House. Everything except for, so the first 2 bills, which include the pause on evictions and education, were voted on by the House, but they have not been voted on by the Senate yet. And that's something we should be looking forward to in the next coming days. And then the municipality bill was passed both by the House and the Senate. So I'll go through that as well. So these are the 3 main votes. So we're going to get started with the housing vote, which was on a pause on evictions and foreclosures. Essentially, this bill, H.4615, 4615, put a pause from now until 30 days after the state of emergency is lifted. So as we probably all know, we had a state of emergency that happened earlier last month. And so they're saying as long as that there's a state of emergency, we will not have any evictions or foreclosures from when the state of emergency is lifted 30 days afterwards. That is what the House voted on. And so some of the good parts of this bill is that there are very limited exceptions for landlords to evict tenants or foreclose, or for banks to foreclose on homes. The only conditions under which someone can get evicted or lose their housing is if there is criminal activity, or if there is a lease violation that is detrimental to the health and safety of the residents in that building. So it's a pretty limited set of exceptions to this pause on evictions and foreclosure. So that's a really good thing that we've seen. And the second piece around it that's really good is that landlords can't send notices to tenants requesting them to leave. So you actually aren't allowed to do that. That's another thing that's another kind of positive part of this bill. I should also mention that if anyone has any questions during the time of this live stream, please feel free to put them in the comments section, and we have a moderator who will be sending me those questions along the way. So if there's anything that's unclear or need clarification, please do send that to us via the comments section. So moving forward, there are some negative parts of this bill. The negative pieces are tenants only have 30 days after the state of emergency to pay back outstanding rent or mortgage payments. It's really important to point out that this is a pause on evictions. It does not mean that you're like there's any sort of financial actual relief. It's just a delay in having being foreclosed on or evicted. So just to give an example, if we have a state of emergency for 6 months, during those 6 months plus 30 days, you will not be evicted or foreclosed on or kicked out of your home for not paying. However, at the end of those 6 months, you have 30 days to pay back the 6 months in payment, which is, in my opinion, 30 days is not enough time to do that. If you have had, I know people who own small businesses or are unable to work right now. Yes, after the crisis is over and after the state of emergency is lifted, sure, you can work again, but then you would have to make up all that lost time in money you haven't earned to pay your rent or your mortgage in the course of 30 days. And so I think this 30-day time window is far too short. I would have expected something much longer that would have helped people get back on their feet after this crisis. Expecting that to happen in 30 days is a little bit too ambitious. And then the second piece is that there is language in the bill that says that it requires tenants to provide proof. It's unclear what proof is, that their non-payment was due to COVID-19. Otherwise, tenants can face late fees. And I think that's another exception in there that shouldn't have been there. Providing proof that your non-payment was due to COVID-19 is really vague, and it's unclear how administratively that would be handled. And so I would have preferred not to have that kind of language in there around some sort of exceptions, especially given that COVID-19 is hitting us pretty much across the board. And so having people do some sort of administrative hurdle to prove that they weren't able to pay seems a little bit inappropriate given the conditions that we're in right now. So moving on to the education bill, this is H.4616. 4616. This was voted on actually yesterday evening. Just a quick summary of it, just 2 points. One, it gave the education commissioner, his name is Riley, who works under Governor Baker, permission on whether to hold MCAS and whether what the high school graduation requirements are during COVID-19. That's one of the big things that this bill did. And then the second piece is that it extended the deadline for school committees to submit their plans on the Student Opportunity Act funding. Just to give a little background information on that, last fall, our House passed the Student Opportunity Act. This was a once in a generation landmark bill that increased funding to schools by $1.5 billion. One of the conditions under which this bill would be implemented across different school districts is that school committees would have to submit plans on how they were going to spend that additional funding. And that plan was due on April 1st. So yesterday, April 2nd, they told school committee members like, oh yeah, you have an extended deadline to submit your plans on the Student Opportunity Act. So some of the bad things, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of great things in this education bill. The bad stuff is that, one, they voted on with no input from teachers and most reps. It's really important to point out that this bill was put online yesterday around 4 p.m. We're unsure because, unfortunately, even reps don't get an email notification or any sort of notification when a bill comes up. You just are expected to, press refresh on your browser to see if anything's been updated. But the bill was released around 4 p.m. And it was voted on a little after 5. And so basically, we had, including reps, these are like reps that are, representing us and should know what's going on, had incredibly little time to react to this bill. And unfortunately, this bill did a lot of things wrong in terms of what the teachers' unions were asking for. And unfortunately, I'll go through that in a minute, but just the fact that this was done in such a top-down way without any sort of input from state reps, except for some of the very few state reps in leadership, was a really important way to make laws, particularly around something as important as education. I should mention, that's another struggle in the State House is that everything is done through informal session. And so it would, there is ways for them to be all on a Zoom call, right? But instead, if you wanted to object or file an amendment or do something to stop this bill, you essentially need to physically be in the chamber. And literally we had state reps being like, cool, I was given like almost no notice. I don't live within 10 minutes of the State House. I can't rush there right now. It's like physically impossible for me to do that. And unfortunately, that bill was just rammed right through with very little heads up or notice. And I just want to point out that, Zoom, for example, gives you the opportunity to up or down vote things. They could have easily done a straw poll across the entire 160 members, but they didn't do that. And so they just really passed this through incredibly quickly with very little notice. And we were all kind of caught off guard at how quickly they passed this. A second piece is that it's really unclear if MCAS is happening this year. I mean, this is something that so many of our constituents here in Somerville, teachers, students have all been concerned about, which is whether MCAS is happening or not, right? Right now, we're in the midst of COVID-19. We are not able to go into school, and we didn't reach any sort of clarity or verdict on what is going on with MCAS in 2020. And that is something that everyone's been so uncertain about. It's been shaping how teachers teach. And we really need an answer on what's going to happen with MCAS this year. A third really important point that they didn't clarify in this bill is it's unclear what high school graduation requirements are going to be. So high school students, currently seniors students, are unclear whether they're going to graduate this year, because part of a graduation requirement in Massachusetts is that you pass the MCAS. And so they haven't made any exceptions given that there's COVID or anything to clarify what's going on there. So we have seniors who are also just kind of left hanging in terms of whether they're going to be able to graduate in June. So that's another piece that's really important, and it hasn't been clarified. It's really just been kicked down. They've kicked the can down the road rather than making a decision in the legislature. They're handing it over to the commissioner to decide. And so really it's, right now it needs to go through the Senate as well, but it's up to the Senate and the commissioner at this point. But the House has essentially decided to not take a position on this, which is really unfortunate, because I know that a lot of state representatives are in favor of canceling MCAS this year. They are in favor of letting high school seniors graduate despite MCAS. And so it's really a shame that this was not decided on yesterday. And finally, for anyone who's a school committee member in the state of Massachusetts, they were really left to an uncertain situation where they weren't sure if they were supposed to submit the plan by April 1st. And even like the Commissioner Riley said, I know this is a little last minute, but I guess we don't need to have school committees submit their plans yet. And I should mention, school committee members meeting under these conditions is not optimal, given that we're in the midst of a global pandemic. But the fact that they really waited till after the deadline to clarify whether or not they have to submit their plans is really poor planning. This is something they really should have just made a clarification on before the deadline, and well before the deadline for that matter. So I think that was another misstep in terms of this bill. And I should also point out, this is a tweet sent out by the House Ways and Means Chair, Chair Milkowitz. He was praising this bill, saying, this is a relief package, right? And he states, one, this is really great. We've redirected housing funds that is normally allocated to homeless shelters to be used in COVID-19 costs. I should point out that that's not a relief, right? That's actually just moving money around. They have not increased the funding. Both we need funding for homeless shelters, so it's a shame that they've moved that away from homeless shelters, and then put that towards COVID-19. But it's a little strange to call that a relief package when they haven't increased any of the funding. They've just shifted it around and taken it away from the most needy people in Massachusetts. And they said it gives more flexibility on how schools administer the MCAS. It really essentially, they didn't really give any flexibility. They just said, okay, the commissioner can decide everything. And so it's really a shame that they're kind of promoting this as a win when we really should have had some clarity for high school seniors as well as teachers, what's going on with MCAS and the graduation requirements. So move on. I think one other thing I want to point out around education that's really important, tied to the Student Opportunity Act. Even though that's been passed into law, the House or the Senate have not allocated or raised the additional $1.5 billion to fund the Student Opportunity Act. They haven't raised more revenue. And obviously, during this crisis, we're expecting the revenue to drop. But the fight's not over in terms of what's going to happen with Fund Our Future and the Student Opportunity Act, because they have passed into law. It does not mean they're going to fund it. And Massachusetts has a history of passing things into law, saying this will be a great thing, but then not funding it is a huge problem. So this is something we really need to look out for over the next few weeks and months as the House goes through all the COVID-19 issues. They also need to pass a budget that will fund the Student Opportunity Act. So it's something to look out for in the next few weeks and months. Now, finally, the municipalities bill, H.4598. 4598. This is the bill that did a number of things. One, it increased flexibility in municipal budgets for fiscal year 2021, as well as with some permitting, or making, issuing permits by city governments. As you can imagine, during the COVID-19 crisis, it does not make sense for city officials or electeds to meet in person to pass budgets. So they've given some extensions in terms of figuring out that budget and figuring out the changes in revenue caused by the COVID-19 crisis and how they're going to address that. Which is good. Second, they delayed the tax deadline to July 15th. So that's another thing that this bill did. And finally, they let restaurants can sell wine and beer now. So cool. And then finally, I think the biggest piece about this bill is the utilities cannot be shut off. And I'll speak more on that in a minute. So again, some of the good things. It helps municipal electeds avoid putting themselves in risky situations of meeting in person. So by giving some flexibility to municipalities, that enables that, which is very good. The second piece that's very good is that, the delay in the tax deadline. Obviously, there are some issues around having to figure out when our taxes will be due. So the fact that they've delayed that to July is a good thing. So we're very appreciative of that. And hey, now we can get more alcohol with your takeout. So, I'm sure we all need a little bit of that these days. So now on to the bad. The municipality bills took over 2 weeks to pass. I mean, this is a bill that has been going back and forth with the House and the Senate because they fought over different pieces of the language over those 2 weeks. I mean, this is something that should have been passed 2 weeks ago. The thing that if you watch, how the text changed between the House and the Senate over the past 2 weeks, the big thing they were fighting over was whether water utilities can be turned off. The House wanted the ability for municipalities to shut off your water, and the Senate said absolutely not. And in the midst of this COVID crisis, we should not be shutting off anyone's water, right? We need to be washing our hands. I think another piece that's also related to that was really bad is that we need, in the language, again, it says you must prove, right, a demonstrated inability to pay due to circumstances related to the outbreak of 2019. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you can't pay your utility bill for them to not shut off your utilities. Again, this is a piece of language that should not be in there. It should be very clear that nobody, under no circumstance, I don't care what your ability to prove if you can pay or not is, should have their water shut off under any circumstance. And so I think that's another piece that's unfortunate part of this bill. And I would have much preferred not to have such a language in there. I just can't imagine any situation where you should be turning off someone's water when everyone should be washing their hands to stay safe during this pandemic. I just want to end that. Those were the 3 votes. I'm just going to maybe pause for a second to see if there's any questions. Seems like no, I'm not getting anything through the, let's see, there are no questions. Cool, confirmed. Great, all right, so I just wanted to end this live stream with a few things. Just to point out, the issues that I took with a lot of these bills were around having these exceptions, around, whether or not you can prove your ability to pay for your rent, or you can prove your inability to pay your water bill. The issue I have with that kind of language is that the financial hardship of COVID-19 is incredibly widespread. So this is something that Commonwealth Magazine, an amazing publication, you should all check it out, put out there from research by Mass Inc., shows this graph around financial hardship. So if we just look at the red bar right here, this is the percentage of each income group and what percentage of them are facing hardship. So, right now in this moment, you have, people, the red line is everyone who earns under 50K. Right now we are about 2 weeks to a month into this crisis, and it's going to grow rapidly, right? As the longer this crisis continues, the larger percentage of people are going to experience financial hardship. As you can imagine, people with lower income levels are going to, a greater percentage of them are going to experience hardship than higher income individuals making, more than 150K. So that's really just the difference between these different colored lines. The top red line being people making under 50K. The dark gray line is people making over 150K, and then you have everything in between. And as this crisis continues from, already happening in less than 2 weeks, 2 weeks to a month, 1 to 2 months, 2 to 4 months. I mean, this crisis is expected to continue for the next at least few months, and I mean, just generously, at least 2 months, right? So as you can see, these are the percentages of the different groups, income groups that are going to experience financial hardship. I mean, this is going to be a widespread crisis affecting all of us. And so I think, when we provide sort of like need for proof, you're designing laws around the exception. And the exception in this crisis is that you're not facing financial hardship, right? That's the exception. The exception is not facing hardship. So people should not have to prove what most people are experiencing. And that is why I'm taking issue to some of these pieces of language in the bill that says, you need to be able to prove. And just like, frankly, the administrative burden, right, of showing or proving, as well as, the government having to confirm that you can pay, or whatever that process is, which is still unclear. That's a piece that just shouldn't be in these laws, particularly in these moments of crisis. There shouldn't be any sort of complications or uncertainty around turning off your water or not losing your housing. So that's just something I wanted to share with you all around what's going on. And finally, in terms of just what's going on, I'll leave with you all with this. Massachusetts residents need government-funded relief in this moment. We are facing an unprecedented economic crisis. What the role of government in times like this is to provide stimulus, right? It's similar to how, in the 30s with the Great Depression, you had funding from the New Deal, right? Put people back to work. I mean, that is the role of government that can play during crises like this, especially when people literally cannot work right now. And so we need government-funded relief. We need government to be stepping in and putting money into our economy and ensuring that nobody is left homeless, nobody's left in an incredibly dire or vulnerable situation. And what we don't need right now is austerity. And the Massachusetts state government can take on debt. The Massachusetts state government can tax wealthy people or capital more, because that is something, as a state, as a country, right, we have the wealth and the money to ensure no one goes hungry, no one goes homeless during this crisis. It's a question of political courage to go against what are the special interests, right, pushing against that to ensure that happens. And so that's just something I really want to point out, especially as the next few weeks and the next few months of this crisis continues. We should be expecting our government to be funding relief. And unfortunately, this week, there wasn't really any funding, right? It was all just around not turning off your water bill. It was around not being kicked out of your homes. And these are all like basic necessities. And I'm thankful that we passed them, but it's taken them so long to even to get to that point. And we need bolder leadership that addresses these issues now. And we haven't seen any sort of real relief from our state government. And we need to see that, particularly now when our federal government is frankly failing us. And so that's something that I want to encourage everyone to push their representatives to do. It is something that if I'm elected, I will fight for. And so I'm going to leave you all with that point, and thank you all for joining me. I think it seems like we don't have any questions, but if you have any questions that come up after this live stream, please feel free to reach out. You can message me directly on my Facebook page. You can also message me from my website, which is electerica.com. And then, of course, you're probably on my Facebook page if you're watching this live stream, but you can also contact me via Facebook or Twitter. So feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to answer any questions you all might have about what's happening in the State House and what likely will happen. So thank you all for joining me this Friday, and I will look forward to seeing you all next week for the next Massachusetts State House update. Thanks so much.